Assalamu alaikum, welcome to a new video. Today we're going to talk about synapses, the relays of the nervous communication. We learned previously about what we call the reflex arc, or how the nervous message moves along the nervous system. It starts with the sensory neuron, then the interneuron, which is in the central nervous system, in the spinal cord or the brain. Then it completes to the motor neuron. And we learned the parts of a neuron, its types, etc. Now, the thing that we're going to learn today is about how is the nervous message transported or transmitted from the first neuron to the second neuron and then to the third neuron. What is between the neuron number 1, for example, and the second neuron? Or even when we are talking about a neuron that is connected to an organ, to a muscle, for example, like the motor neuron. How is the message transmitted from the neuron to the muscle or the gland that is connected to it? For this reason, we're going to learn a new term today, or a new structure, which is called synapse or synapses. A synapse is a junction, a link between the end of a neuron and the beginning of another neuron or another structure like a muscle fiber, a gland, etc. This junction is made of two parts. The end of the neuron is called the presynaptic end or the presynaptic neuron, and the beginning of the other structure is called the postsynaptic element. Now, in this junction, this is not an empty space. It is filled, or it is connected using certain chemicals we're going to learn about today in this video. Okay, if we're going to learn the parts of the synapse, we'll look at this diagram. First of all, the main parts of a synapse are, as we said, the presynaptic element or the axon terminal. Pre means before the synapse, or the first part. Then we have the postsynaptic element, which here is a dendrite, for example, because this is a beginning of a neuron. It might be also a muscle fiber, it might be also a gland, etc. And between them, which seems as if it's empty, is what we call the synaptic cleft. So this space here is called the synaptic cleft. In the presynaptic element, or here the axon terminal, we have certain bags or sacs, and these bags are called vesicles or synaptic vesicles. The word vesicle means a bag, and these sacs or vesicles are filled with chemical substances called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are the most important part of a synapse because they do all the function. They are the key for the transmission of the message from one neuron to the other neuron, or to a muscle or gland, etc. Other things that are found in the synaptic presynaptic element, for example, we have voltage-gated Ca2 plus channels, and we'll see later why are there Ca2 plus channels here. What does the Ca2 plus do? We have here some things that are called neurotransmitter transporter. It can get the neurotransmitter in or out of the axon terminal. It's not that important here. And we have the most important or very important structure in the postsynaptic element, which are the receptors. These are called receptors. They are protein structures found on the, for example, the dendrites of the neuron, the new neuron, or the membrane of a muscle or a gland. We're going to learn now how does the synapse work, or what are the steps of the synaptic transmission. Now let's talk about the steps of synaptic transmission, or how does the synapse work to transmit the nervous message from one neuron to another, or from a neuron to another structure like a muscle or gland, as we said before. First of all, let's look at this diagram. starting with an action potential reaching the action terminal. And if you want to remember what do we mean by action potential, you can click here on the card that's on the top of the screen, and you can learn more about what do we mean by action potential. Now, when an action potential or a nervous message reaches the action terminal or action ending, this triggers the voltage-gated Ca2 plus channels to open. Okay, so the first step is reaching of an action potential to the action terminal. This action potential, because there's a potential difference, opens the voltage-gated channels, because these channels work on voltage difference, potential difference. When there is a potential difference, they open, and Ca2 plus enters to the presynaptic element or the action terminal. They enter inside the action terminal. This entering of the Ca2 plus causes the vesicles, this is a signal that causes the vesicles to move and reach what we call the docking protein. So these vesicles or sacs, they move towards the membrane and dock or sit on certain proteins called docking proteins. After they dock here, these vesicles, they release the neurotransmitters that are inside them by a process called exocytosis. Exocytosis is one of the types of cell transport, and you can also click on the card you see here to remember what we talked about when we talked about the types of cell transport. We also have a video about this. So when the neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis, they are released, of course, into the synaptic cleft, and they bind to the receptors that we talked about, which are on the postsynaptic element, like, for example, the dendrites of the second neuron. So neurotransmitters bind to the receptors, and this binding to the receptor, as any other thing, any other place in our body that works by this mechanism, for example, where a protein, a structure binds to a receptor, there's a key and lock phenomenon here. This activates something. This leads to a thing that happens, okay? And since we are talking about neurons here and nervous message, this binding leads to the formation of an action potential or a graded potential that this is a signal, for example. So this leads to something to happen in the postsynaptic element. For example, sometimes the Na plus channel open, and an A plus entered to the neuron, and this leads, as we learned before also in the action potential video, to the formation of an action potential, generation of a nervous message. Sometimes, okay, when this happens by depolarization. Some other times, and we're going to talk about it later in the video, other channels open, like Cl minus channels, and in this case, instead of depolarization, we have hyperpolarization. We're going to talk about all this later on in the video. Just keep watching the video with us. And now, after we talked about the transmission of the synaptic transmission, we have to learn something about the types of synapse. First of all, before everything we said in this video, originally there are two main types of synapses. One is a chemical synapse and the other is an electric synapse. Now, all this video is talking about only chemical synapses, because we are talking about how the neurotransmitters, which are chemical substances obviously, how do they transmit an electric message from the first neuron and then link it to the other neuron, which also carries an electric message. So this chemical synapse depends on the action of neurotransmitters. While when you talk about electric synapse, they are just like neurons. They work by action potential. We're not going to talk about them in this video. Now, as everything else in science and biology, when we want to classify things, we have to classify them according to a certain criterion. So now we're talking about the types of synapses according to the postsynaptic element. Okay, so starting with the first type of synapse, we have here a neuron 1, and the synapse here connects neuron 1 to another neuron, which is called neuron 2 here, for example. Just like when we are talking about the reflex arc, the sensory neuron, then the interneuron, and then the motor neuron. These are all neurons connected to each other. In this case, the synapse is called neuronal synapse. So neuronal stands for neuron, then neuron, and this synapse is between these two neurons. The second type of synapse is when we see a neuron connected to a muscle fiber. Just like the motor neuron, for example, it's connected to an effector organ, which is the muscle, for example, of the leg or the hand, etc. In this case, the synapse is called neuromuscular synapse. So it's a synapse between a neuron and a muscle. The third type here is between a neuron and glands. Also, just like the motor neuron, it sometimes, as we said earlier in the video of behavioral reactions, you can also click on the card here to watch it. Sometimes the motor neuron is connected to a gland because it works to modify something in the body, secrete certain hormones, etc. In this case, the synapse is called the neuroglandular synapse because obviously it's between a neuron and a gland. So these types of synapses are classified according to the type of the postsynaptic element. We're going to watch or see other types of other classification of synapses according to their function. Here we have a note that also there's another type of classification or way of classifying, for example, synapses is according to their location between neuron and neuron. So it's a neuronal synapse. But for example, there is an axodendritic synapse where the synapse is between the axon and the dendrite of the other neuron. There is an axosomatic synapse, where the synapse is between the axon and the cell body of the neuron, the second neuron. There is an axonic synapse which is between an axon and the axon of another neuron. And finally, there is a dendrodendritic synapse between two dendrites. So this is also another way to classify synapses according to their location. Another way or another criterion to classify synapses is by their function. What do they do? How is their effect? And here we're calling them the nature of synapses, but obviously and technically it's the same thing. Nature and type don't differ. We are talking about different criterion for classification. Let's talk about the first type of synapse, the first nature. For example, we have an axon ending, and inside this axon ending there are vesicles containing a neurotransmitter called glutamate. This is one type of the neurotransmitters. Here in this case, when the glutamate is released and binds obviously to the receptors, this causes the opening of Na+ channels in the second neuron, for example. So the opening of the Na+ channels, as we learned earlier in the video of action potential also, leads to the depolarization because there is difference in the ions and the charge between inside and outside of the membrane, and this causes a depolarization where the voltage increases. This depolarization is actually an excitation. Where, for example, the muscle contracts, where another nervous message is moves or is transmitted through the second neuron, etc. In this case, this synapse is called an excitatory synapse, and it's abbreviated by EPSP. So the first type of synapse is an excitatory synapse where its action leads to a new action potential in the second neuron, for example. Or, for example, let's say if it's a neuromuscular synapse, it leads to the contraction of the muscle because there is a depolarization, so there is an excitation of the muscle. The other nature, let's talk about another example where a synapse releases a neurotransmitter called GABA. This GABA neurotransmitter causes the opening of other channels in the postsynaptic element, which are the Cl- channels. And when Cl- is released, this time it causes the hyperpolarization, where instead of the increase in the potential difference or the voltage of the postsynaptic element, the voltage decreases more. It becomes less than minus 30 millivolt. In this case, the synapse is inhibitory synapse. It's the opposite of excitatory. It's an inhibitory synapse, or abbreviated IPSP. Here in this case, for example, when there are certain mechanisms in the body to reduce pain, where our neurons naturally release neurotransmitters to try to reduce our sensation of pain, and this mechanism depends on inhibitory synapses, where, as we said, instead of for example, contraction of the muscle, there is relaxation, and etc. Now, some examples of neurotransmitters that are mostly used by the synapses in our body, if we can say so. Let's talk about first adrenaline, which is a very known hormone and a neurotransmitter. It is important for the fight or flight mechanism that is done when we face a situation that requires either we escape or face. Okay, if we're in a jungle and we ran into a lion, for example, there is a high secretion of adrenaline. Another neurotransmitter is noradrenaline. It is responsible for the concentration when we're studying, when we're reading something, etc. Dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. It's also very known, and it's responsible for making us happy, if we say so chemically. Serotonin also is very known, and it's a mood neurotransmitter. It is responsible to say how we feel now. Are we happy? Are we sad? Etc. The GABA neurotransmitter is a calming neurotransmitter, as we watched earlier in the video, because it is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is the most important neurotransmitter in our body. It is responsible for many things like movement, for example, and we can say that it's a learning neurotransmitter because it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate is, for example, a memory neurotransmitter. Obviously, it's used by our brain synapses to remember things. And finally, the endorphin, which is a euphoria neurotransmitter, which is the state of being super happy. Now we reached the end of our video. Of course, there are many other details about synapses that we can maybe talk about later on. Thanks for watching. I hope you come back for new videos. Goodbye.